Dr. Thomas Mitchell stared at the medical chart, his hands trembling as the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in Chicago General's emergency room. The homeless man in bed 7 shouldn't be alive. Some angels don't have wings. They have calloused hands and smell like the streets they call home. The neck wound was horrific, a gaping, infected mass that spoke of months of silent suffering. But it was the patient's eyes that haunted Mitchell. Behind the grime and exhaustion lay something he'd seen before: intelligence, precision, the steady gaze of someone who'd once held life and death in their hands. 24 hours earlier, Benjamin Crawford was just another invisible soul shuffling down Michigan Avenue. Now, as Mitchell read the lab results that would shake the hospital to its core, one question burned in his mind. Who was this man before the streets claimed him? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 7 years ago, Dr. Benjamin Crawford commanded the cardiac surgery wing at Northwestern Memorial Hospital like a maestro conducting a symphony of life and death. His hands, steady as stone, had guided scalpels through thousands of procedures, earning him a reputation as Chicago's miracle worker. Colleagues whispered his name with reverence. Patients traveled from across the Midwest, clutching hope and their life savings, trusting everything to the surgeon who never lost his cool under pressure. But that was before Ruth died, before Tommy vanished into the city's underbelly like smoke through his fingers, before Benjamin Crawford learned that all his medical miracles couldn't save the two people who mattered most. The 2008 financial crisis had been the perfect storm. A malpractice lawsuit, baseless but expensive, arrived just as his world crumbled. Ruth's cancer treatments had drained their savings. When she passed, their son Tommy, consumed by guilt and grief, fell into the abyss of addiction. One bitter October night, after a screaming match about rehab, Tommy walked out into the Chicago darkness and never came home. Ben tried everything: private investigators, missing persons reports, walking every street corner in the city. But Tommy had vanished completely, swallowed by a world Ben didn't understand. The respectable Dr. Crawford couldn't reach the broken boy his son had become. So, Benjamin Crawford made a choice that stunned his colleagues and shattered his comfortable existence. He walked away from Northwestern Memorial, from his Lakeshore Drive penthouse, from everything that defined him. If he couldn't find his son as Dr. Crawford, perhaps he could find him as nobody at all. Grace Sullivan first noticed him 3 years ago at Sacred Heart Shelter. While other homeless men shuffled through the dinner line with vacant stares, Ben moved differently. His eyes tracked everything: who was coughing, who favored their left leg, who showed signs of infection. When old Pete collapsed with chest pains, Ben's hands moved with surgical precision, checking pulse points and clearing airways until paramedics arrived. "You're not like the others," Grace had whispered that night, watching Ben clean Pete's wounds with makeshift supplies. "We're all the same out here," Ben had replied, but his voice carried an education that 7 years on Michigan Avenue couldn't quite erase. Grace Sullivan understood broken men. Her own brother had died of an overdose in these same streets 5 years earlier. She'd transformed Sacred Heart from a simple soup kitchen into a sanctuary where Chicago's forgotten could find dignity along with their daily bread. But Ben Crawford remained her greatest mystery, a man who seemed to carry both profound knowledge and unbearable loss in equal measure. Every Thursday, like clockwork, Ben would disappear for exactly 3 hours. Grace never followed, respecting the privacy of a man who'd already lost everything else. She didn't know that those Thursday afternoons were spent at the Cook County morgue, where Ben would steel himself to examine every unclaimed body, praying he wouldn't recognize the face of his son. The storm hit Chicago on October 15th with a fury that caught even seasoned meteorologists off guard. Wind howled down Michigan Avenue like a living thing, driving sheets of rain sideways against the windows of Sacred Heart Shelter. Inside, Grace Sullivan watched the numbers climb. 150, 175, 200 people crammed into a space designed for half that many. The smell of wet clothing and unwashed bodies mixed with the aroma of industrial coffee and yesterday's donated bread. Grace moved through the chaos with practiced efficiency, her auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail that had long since given up any pretense of neatness. She'd been working 16-hour days since the cold snap began, but tonight felt different. Desperate. The kind of night when people died if they didn't find shelter. "Grace, we got another one coming in," called Marcus, the night volunteer, as the front door burst open against the wind. A figure stumbled through, water streaming from a threadbare coat that might have been navy blue once upon a time. Grace recognized the purposeful gait immediately, even though the man was clearly struggling. Ben Crawford looked worse than she'd ever seen him. His weathered face, usually composed despite the hardships of street life, was flushed with fever. His right hand pressed against his neck in a gesture that seemed both protective and pained. When he tried to speak, his voice came out as little more than a hoarse whisper. "Evening, Grace," he managed, attempting his usual courteous nod. But the motion made him wince, and Grace caught the way his fingers tightened against whatever was troubling him beneath his collar. "Ben, you look terrible," Grace said, abandoning her usual diplomatic approach. "When's the last time you ate something hot?" "I'm fine," he replied automatically, the standard response of every person who'd learned that admitting weakness on the streets could be fatal. Others need the attention more. As if summoned by his words, a commotion erupted near the back corner where the oldest residents typically claimed their spots. Old Pete, a Vietnam veteran who'd been coming to Sacred Heart for 4 years, was on the ground, clutching his chest and gasping. The people around him backed away instinctively, their faces showing that particular helplessness of those who'd seen too much death already. Grace started toward Pete, but Ben was already moving. Despite his obvious illness, he crossed the room with surprising speed and dropped to his knees beside the older man. Grace watched in fascination as Ben's demeanor completely transformed. Gone was the humble, self-effacing homeless man she'd known for 3 years. In his place knelt someone who radiated quiet authority and competence. "Pete, look at me," Ben commanded, his voice suddenly clear and strong despite the hoarseness. His hands moved to Pete's wrist, fingers finding the pulse point with the precision of a musician finding the right key. "How long have you been having chest pain?" "Started about an hour ago," Pete wheezed. "Thought it was just the weather changing." Ben's free hand moved to Pete's neck, checking for irregular pulse patterns while his eyes tracked the veteran's color and breathing rate. Grace noticed how Ben positioned himself to shield Pete from the curious crowd, maintaining the older man's dignity even in crisis. "Grace," Ben called without looking up, "I need you to call 911. Tell them we have a possible cardiac event, male, approximately 70, conscious but in distress. And see if anyone has aspirin, the real stuff, not acetaminophen." The specificity of his request made Grace's pulse quicken. This wasn't the vocabulary of someone who'd picked up first aid from the streets. This was medical training, deep and instinctive. She fumbled for her phone while processing this new information about the man she thought she knew. "How do you know all this?" she asked as she dialed. But Ben was focused entirely on Pete, talking him through breathing exercises with the calm competence of someone who'd done this thousands of times before. The paramedics arrived 12 minutes later, their heavy boots tracking mud across Sacred Heart's worn linoleum. Grace watched their interaction with Ben carefully. Instead of brushing aside the homeless man's assessment, they listened, actually listened. When Ben described Pete's symptoms and vital signs, using terms Grace barely understood, the lead paramedic nodded with professional respect. "Good work keeping him stable," the paramedic said as they loaded Pete onto the stretcher. "You medical?" Ben's face closed off immediately. "Not anymore," he said quietly, and something in his tone warned against further questions. After the ambulance pulled away, Grace found Ben slumped against the wall where Pete had been lying. The adrenaline that had carried him through the crisis was clearly fading, and the fever flush was back in his cheeks. His hand had returned to his neck, and Grace could see him struggling not to show his pain. "Ben," she said softly, settling beside him on the floor. "We need to talk." "Nothing to talk about," he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "That wasn't just basic first aid back there. You diagnosed a heart attack before the paramedics even arrived. You knew exactly what questions to ask, what signs to look for." Grace paused, studying his profile. "Who are you, really?" Ben was quiet for so long that Grace wondered if he'd fallen asleep sitting up. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to age him before her eyes. "I used to help people," he said simply. "A long time ago, before I lost the right to call myself anything but what I am now." "And what's that?" "A man who failed everyone who ever mattered to him." Grace wanted to push, to demand answers to the questions that had been building for 3 years. But something in Ben's posture, the way he held himself like a man carrying an unbearable burden, made her hold back. Instead, she reached into her jacket and pulled out the small notebook she always carried. "I've been watching you, Ben," she admitted. "Not spying, but observing. You help people here more than you probably realize. Mrs. Chen's infected cut that you cleaned and bandaged with strips from your own shirt. The way you talked young David through his panic attack last month, using techniques I learned in my social work training. The night you stayed up with Maria when her baby had that fever, walking the floors and humming until he finally settled." Ben's hand stilled on his neck. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Grace said firmly. "They wouldn't have, and they wouldn't have known how to do it right." She flipped through her notebook, pages filled with observations she'd been collecting almost unconsciously. "You move like someone who's used to being in charge in medical situations. You know things. About symptoms, about treatments, about how to keep people calm in crisis, and every Thursday you disappear for exactly 3 hours." Ben's head turned toward her, and for the first time, Grace saw something like fear in his eyes. "You've been timing my absences?" "I notice patterns. It's part of my job." Grace closed the notebook and looked directly at him. "Ben, whatever you're running from, whatever you think you've done, you're still helping people, still saving lives. Maybe it's time you let someone help you for a change." Ben's laugh was bitter and short. "You don't understand, Grace. I didn't just lose my job or my house. I lost my family. My wife died believing I'd failed her, and my son—" His voice broke slightly. "My son disappeared because I couldn't save him from his own pain. Everything I touch turns to ash." "That's not true," Grace said, but Ben was already struggling to his feet, his hand pressed firmly against his neck as another wave of pain seemed to wash over him. "I should let you get back to work," he said, reverting to the polite, self-effacing manner that had frustrated Grace for 3 years. "Long night ahead." But as he turned to go, Grace caught a glimpse of what his hand had been hiding. Beneath the collar of his worn shirt, she could see the edge of something that made her stomach clench. A mass of some kind, dark and irregular against his skin. The kind of thing that explained his recent weight loss, his increasing fatigue, the way he'd been touching his neck with growing frequency over the past few weeks. "Ben," she called after him, her voice sharper than she intended, "whatever's wrong with your neck, how long has it been there?" He stopped walking but didn't turn around. For a moment the only sound was the storm continuing to rage outside and the murmur of 200 people trying to find comfort in an overcrowded shelter. "Long enough," he said finally, and Grace heard in those two words a resignation that chilled her more than the October wind. Grace Sullivan had learned a long time ago that sometimes saving someone meant becoming their enemy first. As she watched Ben Crawford shuffle toward the men's sleeping area, favoring his right side and still pressing that protective hand to his neck, she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The next morning arrived gray and bitter, with the kind of Chicago cold that cut through even the thickest coats. Grace had barely slept, her mind racing through everything she'd observed about Ben over the past 3 years. The medical knowledge that surfaced in emergencies, the way other homeless residents deferred to his quiet authority when someone was hurt or sick, the careful way he rationed his own pain medication, aspirin he claimed was for headaches, but took with the regularity of someone managing chronic pain. She found him in the shelter's small kitchen, methodically cleaning coffee cups, with the same precise movements she'd seen him use when tending to Pete's heart attack. His face was drawn, and the fluorescent lighting made the fever flush more apparent than it had been the night before. "Morning, Ben," Grace said, pouring herself coffee from the industrial-sized pot. "How are you feeling?" "Fine," he replied automatically, not looking up from his task. But Grace caught the slight tremor in his hands and the way he had to pause between cups to steady himself. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Grace continued, settling at the small table where staff usually grabbed quick meals. "About losing your family, about feeling like everything you touch turns to ash." Ben's hands stilled on the cup he was drying. "Grace, no, let me finish." Grace's voice carried the firm tone she used when dealing with resistant clients. "I've been a social worker for 8 years. I've seen a lot of people who think they're beyond help, but I've also seen what happens when good people give up on themselves." "You don't know what you're talking about," Ben said quietly, but there was less conviction in his voice than usual. Grace pulled out her phone and scrolled to a web page she'd bookmarked during her sleepless night. "Dr. Benjamin Crawford," she read aloud, "Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, pioneered the free cardiac surgery program for uninsured patients, saved over 3,000 lives during his 15-year career." The coffee cup slipped from Ben's hands, shattering against the linoleum floor. He stood frozen, staring at the broken pieces as if they represented something far more significant than damaged dishware. "That man is dead," he whispered finally. "Is he?" Grace stood and moved closer, close enough to see the way his shoulders shook. "Because last night, that man saved Pete Morrison's life. Just like he saved Maria Santos's baby from pneumonia 3 months ago. Just like he's been quietly saving people in this shelter for 3 years." Ben's hand moved instinctively to his neck, and Grace saw him flinch as his fingers found whatever was growing there. "You don't understand. I lost everything. My wife, my son, my career. I failed everyone who ever trusted me." "Your wife died of cancer," Grace said gently. "I found the obituary. Ruth Elizabeth Crawford, beloved wife and mother. And your son, Tommy Crawford. He didn't disappear because you failed him. He disappeared because addiction is a disease that destroys families, not because his father wasn't good enough." "Stop," Ben's voice cracked. "Just stop. You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," Grace replied. "I'm looking at a man who's been punishing himself for 7 years for things that weren't his fault. A man who's so busy carrying guilt that he can't see he's still the same person who dedicated his life to helping others." Ben slumped against the kitchen counter, and for the first time since Grace had known him, he looked every one of his 62 years. "Ruth died believing I'd save her. She had such faith in my abilities, in my hands, in everything I represented. But I couldn't save her, Grace. All those other people, all those successful surgeries. and I couldn't save my own wife. Because you're not God, Grace said simply. You're a doctor, a brilliant one, from everything I've read. But you're still human. Tommy blamed me for her death. Said if I was such a great surgeon, why couldn't I fix his mother? We had this terrible fight the night he left. He was high, angry, screaming about how I'd failed her, and Ben's voice broke completely. I told him he was right. That maybe if I'd been a better doctor, a better husband, she'd still be alive. Grace felt her heart break for this man who'd carried such crushing guilt for so long. Ben, look at me. When he didn't respond, she moved directly into his line of sight. Your son was 21, grieving and struggling with addiction. Addicts say things they don't mean when they're using. You know that. But what if he was right? Ben whispered. What if I could have done more, tried harder, found some treatment I missed? Then you would have, Grace said with absolute certainty. Because that's who you are. That's who you've always been. The man who tries harder than anyone else, who carries everyone's pain as if it were his own. Ben was quiet for a long moment, staring at the broken coffee cup at his feet. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. I've been looking for him, Grace. Every day for 7 years. That's why I'm here, in this world. Tommy fell into the streets, into the drug scene, and I couldn't reach him as Dr. Crawford from Northwestern Memorial, but maybe as just another homeless man. The Thursday disappearances, Grace realized. You're not just wandering the city. You're searching. Cook County Morgue, Ben admitted. Every Thursday for 7 years. I check every unclaimed body, every John Doe, praying I won't see his face, but knowing that if he's dead, at least I'll know. At least I can bring him home to Ruth. Grace felt tears threatening and forced them back. She needed to stay strong for what came next. Ben, that mass on your neck, how long have you been ignoring it? His hand moved to the spot automatically, and she saw him wince again. About 2 years. Maybe a little longer. 2 years? Grace's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. Ben, you're a doctor. You know what that could be. I know exactly what it is, he said quietly. Same cancer that took Ruth. Poetic justice, maybe. Don't you dare! Grace's voice turned fierce. Don't you dare stand there and act like you deserve this, like dying of neglect is some kind of penance for being human. I lost my right to medical care when I walked away from that world, Ben said. These hands, he held up his weathered, calloused hands. They used to save lives every day. Now look at them. I'm just another burden on a system that's already overwhelmed. Grace reached out and grasped his hands before he could pull away. They were rough from years of outdoor living, scarred from countless small injuries, but she could still see the long, elegant fingers of a surgeon beneath the damage. These hands saved Pete last night, she said firmly. They've saved dozens of people in this shelter. They're still the same hands, Ben, still capable of miracles. Grace, please. No! Grace's grip tightened. I'm calling Dr. Mitchell at Chicago General. He's a good friend, owes me some favors. Hey, he'll see you today. I can't afford. The hospital has charity care programs. We'll figure it out. Grace was already reaching for her phone. But first, you're going to stop punishing yourself long enough to let someone help you. Ben tried to pull his hands free, but Grace held firm. You don't understand. Even if they can treat it, even if by some miracle I survive, what then? I'm nobody now. I have nothing to offer anyone. You have everything to offer, Grace said. You have knowledge, compassion, experience. You have hands that still know how to heal and a heart that's never stopped caring about others. The only thing you don't have is forgiveness for yourself. Ben stared at her for a long moment, and Grace could see the war playing out behind his eyes. 7 years of guilt and self-punishment battling against the faintest glimmer of hope. "What if Tommy's really gone?" he whispered. "What if I wasted 7 years looking for someone who's been dead all along?" "Then you wasted 7 years loving your son," Grace replied. "And that's not waste, Ben. That's the most beautiful thing a father can do." For the first time since she'd known him, Ben Crawford began to cry. Not the quiet, dignified tears of someone trying to maintain composure, but the raw, broken sobs of a man who'd been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders for far too long. Grace held his hands and waited for the storm to pass, knowing that sometimes the only way to rebuild something was to let it completely fall apart first. Dr. Thomas Mitchell had seen enough human misery in Chicago General's emergency room to last 3 lifetimes, but the homeless man in bed 7 made him pause in ways he couldn't quite explain. Grace Sullivan's call that morning had been urgent but vague. A long-time shelter resident who needed immediate medical attention but was reluctant to seek help. What she hadn't mentioned was that the patient would arrive looking like he'd been living rough for years while somehow maintaining an air of quiet dignity that seemed oddly familiar. "Mr. Crawford," Dr. Mitchell said, approaching the bed where Ben sat rigidly upright, his weathered hands folded in his lap like he was attending a business meeting rather than a medical examination. "Grace tells me you've been experiencing some discomfort in your neck area." Ben's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I told her this wasn't necessary." "There are people who need this bed more than I do." The response triggered something in Mitchell's memory. Not the words themselves, but the tone. The careful consideration for others even in personal distress. The way the man held himself despite obvious pain. There was something achingly familiar about the entire presentation. "Let me be the judge of that," Mitchell replied, pulling on gloves. "May I examine you?" Ben nodded reluctantly, and Mitchell gently moved aside the frayed collar of his shirt. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The mass was extensive, easily 6 inches across, with irregular borders and areas of obvious necrosis. It was the kind of presentation that should have brought the patient to medical attention months, if not years ago. "Jesus," Mitchell whispered, then caught himself. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "It's stage 4 squamous cell carcinoma," Ben said matter-of-factly. "Probably metastasized to the lymph nodes by now. I'd estimate I have maybe 3 months, possibly 4, if I'm lucky." Mitchell's hands stilled. The clinical assessment was delivered with the detached precision of a medical professional, not the fearful uncertainty of a layperson guessing at symptoms. "You have medical training?" "Had," Ben corrected. "A long time ago." "What kind of training?" Mitchell pressed, something nagging at the back of his mind. Ben was quiet for a moment, his eyes focusing on something beyond the sterile walls of the examination room. "I was a surgeon once, before I lost the right to call myself that." The words hit Mitchell like a physical blow. He stepped back, studying Ben's face more carefully. Beneath the weathered skin and unkempt beard, beneath the hollowed cheeks and the weight loss that came from years of inconsistent meals, he began to see something else. The bone structure was still there, the intelligent eyes, the careful way he held his hands. "What's your full name?" Mitchell asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Benjamin Crawford." The examination room seemed to spin around Mitchell. 5 years ago, his 8-year-old daughter Sarah had been born with a complex congenital heart defect. The surgery had taken 14 hours, and the surgeon who'd performed it had been a legend at Northwestern Memorial. Dr. Benjamin Crawford had literally held Sarah's heart in his hands and rebuilt it, giving Mitchell's daughter a chance at a normal life. "You operated on my daughter," Mitchell said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah Mitchell, hypoplastic left heart syndrome with multiple complications, 5 years ago." Ben's composure cracked slightly, and Mitchell saw recognition flicker in his eyes. Sarah, blonde hair, loved stuffed elephants. She drew me a picture of Dumbo before the surgery. She still has that elephant, Mitchell said, sinking into the chair beside Ben's bed. She's 13 now, plays soccer, honor roll every semester, because of you. How is she? Ben asked, and Mitchell heard genuine caring in the question, the kind of interest that went beyond professional courtesy. She's perfect, completely healthy. The other doctor said the surgery was impossible, that we should consider palliative care. But you? Mitchell shook his head in amazement. You spent 3 days reviewing her case, brought in specialists from around the country. You told me that every child deserves a chance at a full life. Ben's eyes filled with tears. I remember. She reminded me of my son when he was that age. Same determination in her eyes. Your son, Mitchell said carefully. Grace mentioned you'd lost family. Tommy. Ben's voice broke slightly on the name. He'd be 28 now, if he's still alive. I've been looking for him for 7 years. Mitchell processed this information, remembering fragments of hospital gossip from that time period. Dr. Crawford's sudden departure from Northwestern Memorial had shocked everyone. One day, he was the most respected surgeon in the city. The next, he was gone without explanation. Is that why you left? Mitchell asked. To find him? Ben nodded slowly. He fell into addiction after his mother died. Blamed himself, blamed me. One night we fought and he walked out. I tried everything, private investigators, missing persons reports, working through official channels, but Tommy had disappeared into a world where Dr. Benjamin Crawford couldn't reach him. So you became someone who could. I became nobody, Ben corrected. Just another face in the crowd, another homeless man who could move through the places where people like Tommy end up. I thought if I could just find him, convince him to come home, maybe I could save at least one member of my family. Mitchell felt his throat tighten. The man who'd saved his daughter's life had sacrificed everything to search for his son. Ben, the surgery you performed on Sarah, do you know what that meant to me? To my wife? You gave us our daughter's future. And I couldn't give my own son a present worth living for, Ben replied bitterly. That's not true, Mitchell said firmly. Addiction is a disease, not a moral failing, not a reflection of parenting. Try telling that to the father who watched his son spiral into drugs because he couldn't handle his mother's death, who said terrible things in anger and drove that son away forever. Mitchell stood and moved to his computer, pulling up Ben's medical records from his time at Northwestern Memorial. The file was extensive, thousands of successful surgeries, countless lives saved, innovations in cardiac surgery that had been adopted worldwide. Look at this, Mitchell said, turning the screen toward Ben. Look at what you accomplished. The free surgery program you established treated over 800 patients who otherwise would have died. The techniques you developed are still being used today. None of that matters if I couldn't save the people who mattered most, Ben said. It all matters, Mitchell insisted. Every single life you saved matters. And Ben, you're still saving lives. Grace told me about the work you do at the shelter, the way you help people, provide medical care with whatever resources you can find. That's not real medicine, Ben protested. That's exactly real medicine, Mitchell interrupted. That's medicine at its purest form. Helping people who have nowhere else to turn, using whatever tools you have available, asking for nothing in return. Ben was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. I'm dying, Tom. This cancer. I've seen enough cases to know there's no miracle cure waiting. Maybe not a miracle, Mitchell admitted, but there are treatments. Options we didn't have even 5 years ago. And Ben, he paused, choosing his words carefully. You saved my daughter's life. Let me try to save yours. I can't afford— The hell with money, Mitchell said fiercely. Do you think I care about insurance authorization when I'm looking at the man who gave me my daughter's future? We'll figure out the financial piece. What I need to know is whether you're willing to fight." Ben looked up at Mitchell, and for the first time since the examination began, there was something other than resignation in his eyes. What if the treatment works? What if I survive, and Tommy's still gone? What do I do with a life I never expected to live? "The same thing you've been doing," Mitchell replied. "You help people. You use those hands and that brilliant mind to heal whoever needs healing. The only difference is you do it with proper equipment and a warm place to sleep at night." "Grace called you, didn't she?" Ben asked suddenly. "She didn't just happen to know an ER doctor who would see a homeless man immediately." Mitchell smiled. "Grace Sullivan is one of the most persistent people I've ever met. When she called and said she had a patient who needed immediate attention, I knew she wasn't exaggerating. She also mentioned that this patient had been providing medical care to the shelter residents for years. "She's been watching me," Ben said, but there was fondness in his voice rather than annoyance. "She cares about you. A lot of people do, from what I understand. The entire shelter was asking about you when she brought you in." Ben closed his eyes, and Mitchell could see him struggling with emotions he'd kept buried for years. "I don't know how to hope anymore, Tom. I've spent so long expecting the worst that I'm not sure I remember what it feels like to believe things might get better." "Then let me hope for both of us," Mitchell said. "At least until you remember how." Outside the examination room window, Chicago stretched out in all directions, millions of people living their lives, facing their own struggles and victories. Somewhere in that vast cityscape, Ben's son might still be alive, still fighting his own battles with addiction and loss. And here in this sterile room, two doctors sat together, one who had lost everything in his search for family, and another who owed his family's happiness to the first man's skill and dedication. "Okay," Ben said finally, the word barely audible. "Okay, let's try." The surgery was scheduled for Monday morning, October 19th, giving Ben 3 days to prepare for what Dr. Mitchell had warned would be an 8-hour procedure with no guarantees. Word had somehow spread through the shelter community with the speed that only desperate hope could achieve. Grace found herself fielding questions from dozens of residents who wanted to know about their doctor, a title Ben had never claimed but had somehow earned through years of quiet service. "Is it true he was a real surgeon?" asked Maria Santos, the young mother whose baby Ben had helped through pneumonia. "Like in a hospital with fancy equipment and everything?" Grace nodded, still processing the revelation herself. "One of the best cardiac surgeons in Chicago, apparently." "Then why was he living here with us?" The question came from David Chen, a college student who'd ended up on the streets after aging out of foster care. Ben had talked him through several panic attacks using breathing techniques that Grace now realized were probably learned in medical school. "Because sometimes the people who care most are the ones who hurt most," Grace replied, watching through the window as Ben sat alone in the courtyard, staring at something none of them could see. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Mitchell, carrying a thick folder and wearing the kind of expression that could go either way, cautiously optimistic or preparing to deliver bad news. Grace felt her stomach tighten as she watched him approach Ben's solitary figure. Outside, Dr. Mitchell settled on the bench beside Ben, opening the folder between them. The test results from the past 2 days had been extensive: CT scans, MRIs, blood work, biopsies. Ben had submitted to each procedure with the stoic acceptance of someone who understood exactly what they were looking for and what the various outcomes might mean. "I've got good news and bad news," Mitchell began, then caught himself. "Actually, let me rephrase that. I have challenging news and surprisingly hopeful news." Ben's weathered hands folded in his lap, and Mitchell noticed how steady they remained despite everything. "Give me the challenging news first. The cancer is extensive. It's invaded the lymph nodes, as you suspected. and there's some involvement with the surrounding tissue. Under normal circumstances, with a typical patient, I'd be talking about palliative care and maybe 6 months. And the hopeful news? Mitchell smiled despite the gravity of the situation. You're not a typical patient. Your overall health, despite 7 years on the streets, is remarkably good. No diabetes, no heart disease, no major organ damage. Your body has been through hell, but it's a strong foundation. More importantly, the tumor hasn't spread beyond the regional lymph nodes. It's still operable. Ben absorbed this information with the clinical detachment that had served him well during his surgical career. Success rate? For someone your age with this presentation, maybe 30%. But Ben... Mitchell leaned forward, his voice taking on the intensity of someone who'd spent 3 days researching every possible angle. For someone with your medical knowledge, your understanding of post-operative care, your ability to recognize complications early, I think we can do better than 30%. You're gambling with hospital resources on a homeless man, Ben said quietly. There are people with better odds who need those resources. Stop. Mitchell's voice carried the authority of someone who'd made this argument to himself repeatedly over the past few days. You saved my daughter's life. You've saved thousands of lives over your career. And from what Grace tells me, you've been providing medical care to the homeless community for years without any resources at all. If anyone has earned the right to use hospital resources, it's you. Ben was quiet for a long moment, watching pigeons forage for crumbs near a discarded sandwich. Tom, I need you to understand something. I'm not afraid of dying. I've been dying slowly for 7 years, ever since I lost Tommy and Ruth. If this surgery fails, if I don't wake up, I'm at peace with that. But I'm terrified of surviving and finding out that Tommy really is gone forever. At least now, I still have hope. I can still believe that maybe he's out there somewhere, that maybe I'll find him eventually. If I get better, if I go back to being Dr. Benjamin Crawford, what happens if I discover that hope was all I had left? Mitchell felt his chest tighten with emotion. Then you'll grieve. And then you'll find a way to honor his memory by continuing to help people the way you've been helping them. Tommy may be gone, Ben, but the man who raised him, the values you taught him, the love you showed him, that's still alive in you. You don't know Tommy, Ben said, but his voice lacked the bitterness it had carried for so long. He was brilliant, passionate about everything he cared about. When Ruth was sick, he used to spend hours researching her condition, printing out articles about new treatments. He wanted to be a doctor himself once. Tell me about him, Mitchell said gently. Ben's face softened, years seeming to fall away as he accessed memories he'd kept locked away. He was 8 when he announced he wanted to be a surgeon like his dad. Ruth made him a little lab coat for his birthday, and he'd follow me around the house with a toy stethoscope, examining our dog. He had such gentle hands, such a natural instinct for caring for things. What changed? Ruth's diagnosis came when Tommy was 19, just starting his sophomore year at Northwestern. Pre-med, of course. Suddenly, all that medical knowledge he'd been accumulating wasn't academic anymore. He knew exactly what the statistics meant, exactly how brutal the treatments would be. And he watched me, his hero, the surgeon who could fix anything, become helpless in the face of his mother's illness. Mitchell nodded, understanding flooding through him. He saw you as invincible until you weren't. The night Ruth died, Tommy was holding her hand. She'd been unconscious for hours, but when the end came, she opened her eyes and looked at him. Her last words were, "Take care of your father." And Tommy just broke, started sobbing, saying he couldn't take care of anyone, that he'd failed her just like I had. He was grieving, Ben. People say things they don't mean when they're in that kind of pain. But he wasn't wrong, Ben insisted. I had failed her. all my surgical skills, all my medical knowledge, and I couldn't save my own wife. What kind of doctor does that make me? A human one, Mitchell replied firmly. Ben, I've been practicing medicine for 20 years. I've lost patients. Good people, young people, patients I fought like hell to save. Every doctor has. The day we start thinking we're gods instead of healers is the day we stop being effective physicians. Ben stood and walked to the edge of the courtyard, his back to Mitchell. The last conversation Tommy and I had was a screaming match. He'd been drinking, probably using. He was angry about the funeral arrangements, angry that I'd donated Ruth's body to medical research like she'd requested. He said I was treating her like another case study instead of the woman I'd supposedly loved. And you said? I told him he was right. That maybe if I'd loved her more and studied her disease less, she'd still be alive. That maybe I was better at being a doctor than a husband or father. Ben's voice cracked. He looked at me with such disgust, Tom, said he was ashamed to be my son, and then he left, and I never saw him again. Mitchell joined Ben at the edge of the courtyard, watching the Chicago traffic flow past Sacred Heart Shelter. Ben, grief makes people cruel sometimes, makes them say things they spend the rest of their lives wishing they could take back. What if he meant it, though? What if in trying to save him I'm just being selfish, trying to ease my own guilt instead of accepting that some things can't be fixed? Then you're human, Mitchell said simply. And being human means caring too much, trying too hard, refusing to give up on the people you love even when logic says you should. A commotion from inside the shelter caught their attention. Grace appeared at the door, holding her phone and looking excited in a way that made both men turn toward her. Ben, she called, hurrying toward them. I've been making some calls about the surgery, trying to coordinate with the hospital's charity care program. I talked to the social worker who handles cases like yours. Grace, I told you. She recognized your name, Grace interrupted, her eyes bright. Not just from your surgical reputation. Ben, she has a file on you, from missing persons reports, from the police, from social services. You're not the only one who's been looking. Ben went very still. What do you mean? Someone else has been filing missing person reports on you, Ben. Every 6 months for the past 4 years, someone who's been trying to find Dr. Benjamin Crawford. The folder in Mitchell's hands seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the possibility that Grace's words implied. Ben's face had gone pale, and his hand moved to his neck in the gesture that had become automatic whenever he was processing overwhelming emotions. Who? Ben whispered. Who's been looking for me? Grace smiled, tears streaming down her face. Someone who's been clean and sober for 3 years. Someone who works at a recovery center on the South Side. Someone who's been helping other people get their lives back while searching for his father. The Chicago afternoon seemed to stop around them, traffic noise fading to nothing as the implications of Grace's words settled over the small group. 7 years of searching, 7 years of guilt and hope and desperate love might be about to come full circle in ways none of them had dared imagine. The recovery center on Chicago's South Side looked nothing like the sterile medical facilities Ben remembered from his days at Northwestern Memorial. New Hope Recovery occupied a converted warehouse, its brick walls painted in warm colors that somehow managed to feel both professional and welcoming. Grace drove slowly through the neighborhood, her knuckles white on the steering wheel as she navigated streets that told stories of urban decay and stubborn resilience. "Are you sure about this?" she asked for the 4th time, glancing at Ben in the passenger seat. "We could wait until after your surgery, give you time to recover, to process everything." Ben's hand moved to his neck, touching the bandage that covered the biopsy site. The surgery was scheduled for tomorrow morning, and Dr. Mitchell had made it clear that any additional stress could complicate the procedure. But Ben had waited 7 years for this moment, and the possibility that Tommy might actually be here, might actually be looking for him, overshadowed every other consideration. "I can't wait," Ben said quietly. "If something goes wrong tomorrow, if I don't make it through the surgery, I need to know. I need to see him." Grace pulled into the parking lot, and they sat for a moment in the November afternoon light, watching people come and go from the building. Some looked like they were struggling, thin, nervous, carrying the weight of addiction and recovery. Others appeared more stable, volunteers or staff members who moved with the confidence of people who had found purpose in helping others heal. "What if it's not him?" Grace asked gently. "What if it's someone else with the same name or a case of mistaken identity?" "Then I'll know," Ben replied. "Either way, I'll finally know." They walked through the front doors together, entering a lobby that buzzed with quiet activity. A receptionist looked up from behind a desk decorated with inspirational posters and photos of people in various stages of recovery. The walls were covered with success stories, graduation certificates from treatment programs, and thank you letters from families who had been reunited. "We're looking for someone who might work here," Grace began, her social worker training helping her navigate the delicate situation. "Thomas Crawford. He would have been making missing person inquiries about his father." The receptionist's face lit up with recognition. "Tommy? Oh, yes. He's our lead counselor for the family reunification program. He's in a session right now, but I could check if—" "Family reunification program?" Ben's voice was barely audible. "It's Tommy's specialty," the receptionist explained, not noticing the way Ben had gone pale. "He helps people reconnect with family members they've lost to addiction or other circumstances. He says he understands what it's like to be on both sides of that equation." Grace reached for Ben's arm as he swayed slightly. The idea that Tommy had not only survived, but had built a career around helping families heal from the very trauma that had torn their own apart was almost too much to process. "Could you tell him his father is here?" Grace asked carefully. "Ben Crawford is here to see him." The receptionist's professional demeanor vanished, replaced by something approaching awe. "Oh my God, you're the father he's been looking for. Tommy talks about you all the time. He never gave up hope that he'd find you someday." Before Ben could respond, a door at the far end of the lobby opened, and a group therapy session began to disperse. People of various ages filed out, some chatting quietly, others walking alone with the contemplative air of people processing difficult emotions. Last to emerge was a tall man with dark hair and gentle eyes, carrying a folder and talking softly to a young woman who was obviously struggling. Ben's breath caught in his throat. The man was older, leaner than the son he remembered, marked by years of hardship and recovery. But the way he held himself, the careful attention he paid to the person he was counseling, the unconscious gesture of running his hand through his hair when he was thinking, it was unmistakably Tommy. "Dad?" The word cut through the lobby noise like a blade. Tommy had looked up from his conversation and was staring across the room with an expression of disbelief that mirrored Ben's own. The folder in his hands dropped to the floor, papers scattering, but he didn't seem to notice. For 7 years, Ben had imagined this moment. He'd played it out in countless variations, angry confrontations, tearful reunions, cold rejections, desperate embraces. But nothing had prepared him for the reality of seeing his son as a grown man, healthy and whole and helping others find their way back from the darkness that had once consumed him. "Tommy," Ben whispered, and then louder, "Tommy." They moved toward each other like sleepwalkers, navigating around furniture and other people without taking their eyes off each other. When they met in the middle of the lobby, they stood for a moment just staring, as if afraid that sudden movement might make the other person disappear. "I thought you were dead," Tommy said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "When I got clean, when I tried to find you, there was no trace. No job, no apartment, no forwarding address. I thought maybe you'd died of grief or killed yourself because of the things I said. I've been looking for you, Ben replied. Every day for 7 years. I became homeless because I thought that was the only way to reach you, to find you in the places where people like you might end up. People like me, Tommy repeated, and Ben heard the old pain in his voice. I didn't mean— I know what you meant, Tommy said, but there was no anger in it. And you were right. I did end up in those places, overdosed twice, lived on the streets for 3 years, did things I'm not proud of to get money for drugs. You probably walked past me 100 times without recognizing me. The thought that they might have been in the same vicinity, searching for each other without making connection, was almost unbearable. Ben reached out tentatively, and Tommy didn't pull away when his father's weathered hand touched his cheek. You look good, Ben said, meaning it. Despite the lines around his eyes and the weight of experience that showed in his posture, Tommy radiated the kind of peace that came from hard-won recovery. You look healthy. 3 years clean, Tommy said with quiet pride. It took me a long time to get here, Dad. A lot of really dark years where I didn't care if I lived or died. What changed? Tommy smiled, and for a moment Ben saw the boy who used to follow him around the house with a toy stethoscope. I met someone who reminded me that the people we hurt most are usually the people we love most. She helped me understand that addiction is a disease, not a moral failing. That the things I said to you the night Mom died, those came from sickness and grief, not from my heart. You were grieving, Ben said. We both were. The things we said to each other that night were terrible, Tommy finished. And I've spent the last 3 years wishing I could take them back. Dad, I never believed you failed Mom. I was angry and scared and looking for someone to blame for losing her. You were the safest target because I knew you'd never stop loving me, no matter what I said. Ben felt tears streaming down his face, years of guilt and self-recrimination beginning to crack and fall away. I tried to find you. I hired investigators, filed police reports, walked every street in Chicago looking for you. I know, Tommy said softly. When I got into recovery, when I started trying to make amends, I discovered all the reports you'd filed, the missing person cases, the reward money you'd offered. That's when I realized you'd never stopped looking. The missing person reports about me, Ben said suddenly. Grace said someone had been filing reports trying to find me. Tommy nodded. Every 6 months for 4 years. I knew you wouldn't have just disappeared unless something terrible had happened. When I couldn't find any trace of Dr. Benjamin Crawford, I started filing reports about a missing person. I described you, gave them your medical history, your last known address. I thought maybe if you were in a hospital somewhere, or if something had happened to you. I gave up everything, Ben said. My practice, my apartment, my identity. I became nobody because I thought that was the only way to reach you. And I got clean and became a counselor because I thought that was the only way to become worthy of finding you, Tommy replied. We've been circling each other for years, Dad. Both of us trying to fix ourselves so we could save the other. Grace, who had been watching from a respectful distance, approached quietly. I hate to interrupt, she said gently. But Ben, your surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Dr. Mitchell needs you to be at the hospital by 6 a.m. for pre-op. Tommy's face went white. Surgery? Dad? What's wrong? Are you sick? Ben's hand moved automatically to his neck, and he saw Tommy's eyes follow the gesture with the sharp attention of someone who'd learned to read medical signs during his own recovery process. It's cancer, Ben said simply. Advanced, but possibly treatable. I've been ignoring it for 2 years because I thought I deserved to suffer for losing you and your mother. Oh, Dad, Tommy whispered, and the pain in his voice was raw and immediate. No, No, you don't deserve that. You never deserved any of this. The surgery has about a 30% success rate, Ben continued, needing to get all the facts out. If it doesn't work, if I don't make it through, I want you to know that finding you today, seeing what you've become, knowing that you're alive and healthy and helping other people, it's enough. It's more than enough. Don't you dare, Tommy said fiercely. And suddenly he sounded exactly like the passionate young man Ben remembered. Don't you dare give up now. We just found each other again. We have years of catching up to do, years of healing to work through together. You don't get to leave me again. Not when we're finally both in a place where we can actually help each other. Ben looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw strength he'd never noticed before. This wasn't the broken, angry young man who'd walked out 7 years ago. This was someone who'd faced his demons and won. Someone who'd transformed his pain into a tool for helping others heal. I'm scared, Tommy, Ben admitted. Not of dying, but of living and not knowing how to be your father anymore. So much has changed. We're different people than we were when your mother died. Then we'll figure out who we are now, Tommy said simply. Together, one day at a time, like they teach us in recovery. We don't have to fix everything at once, Dad. We just have to start. Outside the recovery center windows, Chicago continued its daily rhythm, unaware that in a converted warehouse on the south side, a father and son were beginning the long journey back to each other. The surgery tomorrow would determine whether they'd have years or months to rebuild their relationship. But today, they had hope. The surgery began at 7:30 on a gray October morning that carried the promise of Chicago's brutal winter. Tommy sat in the family waiting room at Chicago General Hospital, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he watched the clock tick through what Dr. Mitchell had warned would be an 8-hour procedure. Grace had stayed with him through the night, both of them maintaining a vigil that felt as much like prayer as medicine. At hour 3, Dr. Mitchell emerged from the operating room looking grim. His surgical scrubs were damp with sweat, and the expression on his face made Tommy's stomach clench with familiar dread, the same look he'd seen on doctors' faces during his mother's illness. We've run into some complications, Mitchell said, settling heavily in the chair across from them. The tumor is more extensive than the scans showed. It's wrapped around several major blood vessels, and there's significant involvement with the lymphatic system. What does that mean? Tommy asked, though part of him already knew. He'd spent enough time in hospitals during his mother's treatment to understand medical euphemisms. It means the surgery is taking longer than expected. We're having to be extremely careful to preserve blood flow while removing all the cancerous tissue. Ben is stable, but... Mitchell paused, choosing his words carefully. The next few hours are critical. Tommy nodded, feeling the old helplessness wash over him. Can I see him? He's still under anesthesia and will be for several more hours. But Tommy, I want you to know, your father is fighting. His vital signs are strong, and he's responding well to the anesthesia. He's got more fight in him than most men half his age. After Mitchell returned to surgery, Tommy found himself pacing the waiting room like a caged animal. The antiseptic smell of the hospital brought back memories he'd spent 3 years learning to process in therapy. His mother's final weeks, the way she'd grown smaller and more fragile each day, the helpless rage he'd felt watching his father's surgical skills prove useless against her disease. Tell me about your recovery, Grace said suddenly, apparently recognizing his need for distraction. How did you get clean? Tommy stopped pacing and sank into the chair beside her. It wasn't pretty, he admitted. After I left home that night, I fell hard into heroin. Told myself it was the only way to stop the pain of losing Mom, of disappointing Dad. Within 6 months, I was living on the streets, doing whatever it took to get my next fix. What was the turning point? I overdosed in an alley behind a church on the south side. Should have died. Probably would have if not for a homeless woman named Mary who found me and called 911. When I woke up in the hospital, she was sitting beside my bed. She said she'd been praying for me, that God told her I wasn't finished yet. Tommy's voice grew softer as he continued. Mary had been clean for 10 years. She'd lost her own son to an overdose, and she made it her mission to help other addicts find recovery. She didn't lecture me or judge me. She just said, "When you're ready to stop dying, come find me." And you went looking for her? Not right away. I got out of the hospital and went right back to using, but her words stuck with me. When you're ready to stop dying. I realized I'd been dying slowly for 3 years, not just from the drugs, but from the guilt and shame of what I'd said to my father. Grace nodded, understanding the weight of family guilt from her own experience with her brother's addiction. What made you finally get clean? I saw my reflection in a storefront window one day, and for just a moment I saw my mother looking back at me. She looked so disappointed, so sad. And I heard her voice from that night she died, telling me to take care of my father. I realized I couldn't take care of anyone if I was dead. At hour 5, a nurse appeared with an update. The surgical team had successfully removed the primary tumor and was now working on the affected lymph nodes. Ben's vital signs remained stable, but the extensive nature of the surgery meant they were still hours away from completion. Tommy used the break to call his supervisor at the recovery center, explaining the situation and arranging for coverage of his client sessions. As he spoke, he found himself thinking about the people he counseled, addicts and their families struggling to rebuild relationships damaged by years of substance abuse and broken trust. "How do you help families reconnect after addiction?" Grace asked when he finished the call. "Slowly," Tommy said. "Carefully. Most of the time, the addict and the family are both carrying enormous guilt. The addict feels guilty for the pain they've caused, and the family feels guilty for things they said or did during the worst periods. Everyone's walking around with open wounds, afraid to trust, afraid to hope." "Sounds familiar," Grace observed. "My dad and I are textbook cases," Tommy agreed. "We both spent 7 years punishing ourselves for a conversation we had while we were both drowning in grief. I became an addict, he became homeless. We were both trying to disappear because we couldn't forgive ourselves." At hour 7, Dr. Mitchell reappeared, this time with a cautious smile. "We're closing now," he announced. "We were able to remove all visible cancer, and the margins look clean." Ben tolerated the procedure well, though he'll be in recovery for several hours. "Is he going to be okay?" Tommy asked, afraid to hope. "The next 24 hours will tell us a lot," Mitchell said honestly. "But Tommy, I want you to know, your father fought like hell in there. Every time his vitals dipped, every time we hit a difficult moment, he pulled through. It's like he had something to live for that he didn't have before." When they finally allowed Tommy into the recovery room, he was shocked by how small his father looked, surrounded by machines and monitors. Ben's face was pale and drawn, aged by the trauma of major surgery, but his breathing was steady and his vital signs were stable. Tommy pulled a chair close to the bed and took his father's hand, careful not to disturb the IV lines. "I'm here, Dad," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." For the next 6 hours, Tommy maintained his vigil, watching the monitors and talking quietly to his unconscious father. He told stories about his recovery, about the people he'd helped, about the woman he'd met in group therapy who'd become his anchor in sobriety. He talked about his mother, sharing memories that had been too painful to voice for years. "I named the family program after Mom," Tommy said as dawn broke outside the hospital windows. "Ruth's Light Family Recovery Program. We help families navigate the early stages of reunification." Mom would have loved knowing that her death led to something that helps other families heal. Ben's eyes fluttered open just as Tommy finished speaking. For a moment he looked confused, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings and the effects of anesthesia. Then his gaze found Tommy's face, and recognition flooded his features. "You stayed," Ben whispered, his voice rough from the breathing tube. "Of course I stayed," Tommy replied, squeezing his father's hand gently. "I told you, Dad. We just found each other. I'm not letting you go again. The surgery? Dr. Mitchell says they got all the cancer. You're going to be okay, Dad. We're both going to be okay." Ben closed his eyes, and Tommy could see him processing this information, allowing hope to take root for the first time in years. When he opened them again, there were tears streaming down his cheeks. "I'm sorry," Ben whispered, "for everything, for not saving your mother, for not being strong enough to help you through your grief, for disappearing when you needed me most." "Dad, stop," Tommy said firmly. "We both made mistakes. We both said things we didn't mean. But that's in the past. What matters now is what we do going forward." "I don't know how to be your father anymore," Ben admitted. "I don't know how to fit into the life you've built." Tommy smiled, and Ben saw echoes of the boy he'd raised in that expression. "Then we'll figure it out together, day by day, like they teach us in recovery. We don't have to solve everything at once." Outside the recovery room window, Chicago was waking up to another day. Somewhere in the city, families were struggling with addiction, homelessness, and loss. But in this sterile room, surrounded by the quiet beeping of medical equipment, a father and son were taking their first tentative steps toward healing, not just from cancer, but from years of guilt, shame, and misplaced blame. The road ahead would be long and difficult. Ben would face months of recovery and follow-up treatments. They would both need to learn how to trust again, how to forgive themselves and each other. But for the first time in 7 years, they had what neither had dared to hope for: time. Time to heal. Time to rebuild. Time to become the father and son they were meant to be. Christmas Eve arrived in Chicago with a gentle snowfall that transformed the city into something softer, more forgiving than the harsh urban landscape Ben had known during his years on the streets. He stood at the window of his new apartment, a modest one-bedroom place donated by a former patient whose heart surgery Ben had performed 12 years earlier, watching families hurry past with wrapped packages and the particular urgency that comes with last-minute holiday preparations. The apartment still felt surreal to him. After 7 years of sleeping in shelters and doorways, having his own kitchen, his own bathroom, his own bed seemed like an impossible luxury. Tommy had helped him furnish it with simple, practical pieces from thrift stores and donations from the recovery center community. Nothing fancy, but everything chosen with care and love. "Dad, you ready?" Tommy called from the kitchen, where he'd been working for the past hour on something that smelled remarkably like Ruth's famous Christmas morning coffee cake. The recipe had been one of many family traditions lost in the chaos of grief and addiction, but Tommy had somehow managed to recreate it from memory. Ben touched the small scar on his neck where the tumor had been removed 3 months earlier. The surgery had been even more successful than Dr. Mitchell had dared hope. Clean margins, no residual cancer, and a recovery that had amazed the entire medical team. Ben had thrown himself into physical therapy and follow-up treatments with the same intensity he'd once brought to surgical procedures. "Almost," Ben replied, adjusting the tie Tommy had given him for his first day back at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Not as chief of surgery, those days were behind him, but as a volunteer consultant in the new homeless healthcare initiative he'd helped design. 3 days a week, he provided medical care to Chicago's most vulnerable population, bringing the same precision and compassion to street medicine that he'd once applied in sterile operating rooms. The other 2 days he spent at New Hope Recovery Center, working alongside Tommy in the Family Reunification Program. They discovered that their shared experience of loss and rebuilding gave them unique insight into helping other families navigate the complex process of healing from addiction's devastation. A knock at the door interrupted Ben's thoughts. Tommy emerged from the kitchen, flour dusting his dark hair, and opened it to reveal Grace Sullivan, carrying a covered dish and wearing a smile that lit up the entire apartment. "Merry Christmas Eve," she said, embracing both men with the easy affection that had developed over the months of Ben's recovery. Grace had become something between a sister and daughter to Ben, and something much more complicated to Tommy, a relationship that was still finding its footing but showed all the signs of growing into something beautiful. "Grace, you didn't have to bring anything," Ben protested, but she waved him off. "It's green bean casserole made from Ruth's recipe," she said. "Tommy gave me the card she'd written in her own handwriting. I figured it was time to bring a little piece of her to our celebration." The mention of Ruth no longer brought the sharp stab of pain it once had. Instead, Ben felt the warm ache of love remembered, of gratitude for the years they'd shared and the son they'd raised together. Tommy had been right when he'd said they needed to honor her memory by living fully, by loving completely, by refusing to let grief define their future, Doctor. Mitchell arrived 20 minutes later with his wife and daughter Sarah, now 13, and glowing with the kind of health that only comes from a completely repaired heart. She hugged Ben with the easy affection of a child who'd been told from an early age that this man was responsible for her ability to play soccer, to run, to live without limitations. "Dr. Crawford," Sarah said, using the formal title despite Ben's protests that she could call him Ben, "I brought you something." She handed him a carefully wrapped package. "I made it myself in art class." Inside was a framed drawing of Dumbo the elephant, remarkably sophisticated for a 13-year-old's work. But what made Ben's throat tighten was the inscription at the bottom. "For the doctor who gave me wings to fly. Thank you for saving my life and teaching me that some angels don't need wings, they just need caring hands." "Sarah," Ben managed, his voice thick with emotion, "this is beautiful. But you know you saved my life too." "I did?" Ben glanced around the room at the faces of people who'd become his chosen family. Tommy, radiant with 3.5 years of sobriety. Grace, whose dedication to Chicago's homeless had transformed city policy. Dr. Mitchell, whose friendship had bridged the gap between Ben's old life and new. Sarah, living proof that healing was possible even when hope seemed lost. "You reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place," Ben explained. "Not for the prestige or the money, but because sometimes we get the privilege of holding someone's life in our hands and helping them heal. You reminded me that my hands still know how to heal, even when I'd forgotten." The evening unfolded with the gentle rhythm of families learning to be together. They shared stories and laughter, arguments about football teams, and debates about the best way to prepare turkey. Tommy and Grace exchanged glances that made Ben think there might be another addition to their chosen family sometime in the coming year. As midnight approached and the others prepared to leave, Tommy lingered in the kitchen, ostensibly cleaning dishes but clearly working up to saying something important. "Dad," he began finally, "I've been thinking about something and I wanted to run it by you." "Of course, what is it?" "Grace and I have been talking about expanding the family program at the center. We want to create a residential component, a place where families can stay together during the early stages of recovery, somewhere they can rebuild relationships in a safe, supportive environment." Ben nodded, intrigued. "That sounds like important work." "We want to call it the Ruth Crawford Family Recovery House," Tommy said, watching his father's face carefully. "If that's okay with you." I know Mom would have loved the idea of families healing together, of love being stronger than addiction. Ben felt tears blur his vision, but they were tears of joy rather than grief. "Tommy, she would be so proud of you, of the man you've become, of the work you're doing." "Yes, absolutely. Let's honor her that way." "There's something else," Tommy continued, his voice growing uncertain. "The house will need a medical director. Someone who understands both the medical aspects of addiction recovery and the family dynamics involved. Someone who's been through it himself." "You want me to help run it?" "I want us to run it together," Tommy corrected. "Father and son, using everything we've learned about loss and healing to help other families find their way back to each other." Ben looked around the apartment that had become home, thinking about the journey that had brought them here. 7 years ago, he'd been Dr. Benjamin Crawford, chief of surgery, living in a world of professional accolades and personal isolation. Then he'd become nobody, a homeless man searching for his lost son in the darkest corners of the city. Now he was something new. Still a doctor, still a healer, but also a father who'd learned that love sometimes meant losing everything in order to find what truly mattered. He was a man who'd discovered that healing wasn't just about technical skill or medical knowledge, but about showing up for people in their darkest moments and refusing to give up on them. "Yes," Ben said simply. "Yes, let's do this together." Outside, the snow continued to fall over Chicago, covering the streets where Ben had once searched desperately for his son. Tomorrow, families across the city would wake up to Christmas morning, some together, some still separated by circumstances beyond their control. Some would be healing, some would still be broken, some would be taking their first tentative steps toward recovery. But in a modest apartment on the north side, a father and son sat together in comfortable silence, planning their future and honoring their past. They'd learned that some angels don't have wings. They have calloused hands and broken hearts and the courage to keep loving when love seems impossible. They'd learned that healing isn't always about cutting out what's diseased. Sometimes it's about nurturing what's still healthy until it's strong enough to flourish again. Most importantly, they'd learned that family isn't just about blood or genetics or shared history. Family is about showing up again and again, even when it's difficult. Family is about forgiveness that runs deeper than mistakes. Family is about hope that refuses to be extinguished, even in the darkest times. As Ben prepared for bed in his own bedroom for the first time in years, he thought about Ruth and the promise he'd made at her grave all those months ago. "I kept my promise," he whispered to her memory. "Tommy's home. We're both home." Outside his window, Chicago slept under its blanket of Christmas snow, and in the morning the work of healing would continue. But tonight, for the first time in 7 years, Ben Crawford fell asleep knowing that he was exactly where he belonged, surrounded by people who loved him, not despite his scars, but because of the journey that had created them. In the end, that's what miracles really are. Not the dramatic interventions that capture headlines, but the quiet daily choice to keep loving, keep hoping, keep showing up for each other, one day at a time. Some angels don't have wings. They have hands that know how to heal, hearts that refuse to give up, and the wisdom to understand that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply staying. Dear friends, if you've made it this far in Ben and Tommy's story, you understand something profound about the human heart. It's never too late to come home. For those of us who've lived long enough to know real loss, who've watched our children struggle, who felt the weight of regret over words we can't take back, this story isn't just entertainment, it's a mirror. Ben spent 7 years believing he'd failed everyone who mattered, punishing himself by becoming invisible on Chicago's streets. Tommy spent those same years drowning in addiction, convinced his father's love was beyond repair. Yet, on a snowy Christmas Eve, they sat together in a modest apartment, planning a future neither had dared imagine. The truth is, our greatest failures often become our most powerful tools for helping others heal. The hands that once held scalpels found new purpose caring for society's forgotten. The son who'd been lost to addiction became a beacon of hope for other struggling families. Love doesn't always look like success. Sometimes it looks like showing up in the mess, refusing to give up, choosing hope when logic says otherwise. Some angels don't have wings. They have weathered hands and hearts that won't quit loving. Questions for you. Have you ever had to forgive yourself for words spoken in grief? What would you do if you had one more chance to heal a broken relationship? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.